Courtney Felton. I am the Curator of Education here at the North Carolina Maritime Museum, and I am very excited to talk about the wreck of the Caribsea as part of our Maritime Heritage Lecture Series. As I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, and the recording will go onto the museum's YouTube page after the fact. So if you have any questions and you want to look at it again, you want to listen to my voice to help you fall asleep, it will be available for you. And for your peace of mind, I guess, as well, you are not being recorded and your voices are not being recorded. So we are talking about the wreck of the Caribsea. Now, the way that I have structured this talk, we're going to discuss a little bit about shipwrecks off the coast of North Carolina, talk a little bit about the intro to World War II and what was going on off the North Carolina coast, and then we will eventually get to the Caribsea's story. So if we start, maybe. Got it. This area off the coast of North Carolina is often called the graveyard of the Atlantic. And there are a number of reasons for this. So starting off with non-human reasons, a big thing we see are storms. So North Carolina is very lucky to have a hurricane season that runs from May until November. And then on top of hurricane season, we have nor'easter season. And nor'easter season is really year-round, but the worst of it tends to be November through March. If you are local and you got to experience that lovely foot to foot and a half of snow, depending on where you live, that was due to a nor'easter. And we have researchers looking into this. This is an adapted chart from an overview of North Carolina shipwrecks with an emphasis on Beaufort. And it mapped out 2,500 shipwrecks and removed any shipwrecks that were for intentional scuttling, were due to warfare, things along those lines, just looking at storms. And you can see that, oh, that's not going to show. At the peak of hurricane season, August, September, October, we have a lot more wrecks. And then again, in that sort of peak of nor'easter season, in the winter months, we have a good number of wrecks due to storms. On top of storms, we have shifting sand. So modern times, currently, there are 5 inlets between the Outer Banks and Cape Lookout. But there have been as many as 24 inlets along the coast. And each of those inlets is going to have sand moving in and out with every tide. The image on your right is of an inlet down by Topsail. It was taken from an aerial view, and you can see all of that sand, all of that shoaling sand that moves in and out. And if you ask a captain around here if they have ever run aground on a sandbar or anything, and they tell you no, they either are not a captain or are lying. I have seen our really phenomenal ferry captains occasionally run aground on that shifting sand, and they run those routes multiple times a day. So it makes it very challenging to navigate through this space. Adding on top of that, we have currents, and we have some pretty strong currents. So this is an aerial view looking at sea surface temperature. Our reds and oranges and yellows are going to be warmer temperatures, blues and greens and purples are colder temperatures. North Carolina is located right here, and our nice warm Gulf Stream is coming up right along the coast. And then we also have a nice little blue, colder water current coming down. That is part of the Labrador Current. It is sometimes called the Labrador Current Extension. It is sometimes called the Virginia Current, depending on who you ask. But that cold water and that warm water are meeting right off of Hatteras and can lead to a lot of fog. It can lead to a lot of storms and just a difficult area to navigate. So mariners have been having to deal with these currents as they go up and down the coast for hundreds of years. And we have seen a couple of different techniques for this. And so I'm going to mention this briefly. So we have our currents. I have added a red arrow to showcase the Gulf Stream. And if we're talking about ships going from north to south, they have to move against the Gulf Stream. And there are a couple of ways that they can do this. So one method is that they can go outside of the Gulf Stream. This tends to add time to their journey, but they can move around it. Option 2 is to just force your way down the Gulf Stream. If you are in a motorized vessel, that's going to be easier than a sailing vessel. And then option 3 is to try to cut the distance between the Outer Banks and that current. And the Gulf Stream moves. It doesn't stay in one location. It shifts anywhere from 10 to 35 miles off of Hatteras. So that would be a challenging, narrow area to have to make your way through. Now, what this leads to is another nickname for this area because you end up having a bit of a bottleneck while trying to travel. And that is Torpedo Junction. Where are these torpedoes coming from? Submarines. So the Germans had their U-boats off the North Carolina coast in both World War I and World War II. I grew up learning that World War II was not fought anywhere near the United States. It was not until I moved to South Carolina for college I realized how wrong I was. It's what happens when you grow up in the middle of the country. I knew a lot about the War of 1812. I knew a lot about Civil War. Not so much this. So these submarines are active off of the coast, and they are doing a lot of damage. We've introduced what's happening off the coast. This is what leads to thousands of shipwrecks. There's a really nice shipwreck map that has been created that showcases not all, but many of the wrecks off the coast. So let's talk about World War II. I'm just going to give a brief overview in case anyone is not as familiar with the start of World War II. So in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland. At that time, Great Britain tells Germany, you need to leave Poland. On September 3rd, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, announces the British deadline for the withdrawal of German troops from Poland has expired. The British ambassador to Berlin notifies the German government that unless they announce plans to withdraw from Poland, a state of war would exist between the two countries. As we are aware, Germany does not withdraw. And on that same day, France follows suit and also declares war against Germany. Again, on that same day, it was a big day. On September 3rd, the ocean liner Athenia is sunk by the German U-30. There were more than 1,100 passengers on board, 112 of whom lost their lives, and of those, 28 were American. So this is happening. At the same time, the United States is working to get themselves out of the Great Depression. They are not super excited to enter the prospect of another global war. And while we are supplying our allies we're trying to keep our hands out of this. This all changes on December 7th, 1941, with the attack on the US Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. This occurred after a year of tariffs were placed on Japan for what they were doing in Indochina. And quickly after this attack on December 8th, the US declares war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States as part of the tripartite pact with Japan. And later that same day, the US Congress issues a declaration of war against them. So this is what's happening. When the US declares war against Germany, immediately upon that time, a German admiral named Karl Donitz puts through what is called Operation Pockenschlag or Operation Drumroll or Operation Drumbeat, depending on which book you read and which translation you look at. But the plan of attack was to take advantage of vulnerable merchant ships and sea lanes along the Atlantic coast using U-boats. Now, Admiral Donitz had actually spent the time after World War I coming up with this plan. He wanted to have a plan ready to go to attack the Atlantic convoys, seeing that the United States was an industrial power, had created a lot of materials that would be moving across the Atlantic. So was trying to come up with this plan. And he initially petitioned to have 12 U-boats sent. 6 of them were of the new IX or IXC class, which is the model that I have displayed right here. They had more fuel capacity, they could go further, and they also had more armaments. He was denied. The German military was really focused on other campaigns, specifically in the Mediterranean as well as in Norway, and wasn't willing to give up these ships. So the admiral went back to the drawing board and he looked at the entire U-boat fleet, and there were 91 U-boats. 33 of them were in dry dock. 33 of them were already fighting in Norway, the Mediterranean, and Gibraltar. And 20 of them were en route to those locations. If you do the math, that leaves 5. So he said, well, 5 is better than nothing. And so these 5 U-boats, each with a deck gun and 14 torpedoes, made their way across the Atlantic. So here is an example of one of those U-boats, the U-123. The U-123 is actually one of the first 5 that went across. And this is a photo from 1944. They are leaving from France. The U-123 was the second U-boat to begin attacking merchant vessels off the coast of North Carolina. The first was the U-66, which attacked the tanker, the Alan Jackson, on January 18th, 1942. So the plan, he had thought about this, right? So he had learned that, one, the British had a new sonar pinging system called ASDIC, and he wanted to avoid that and thought, if I'm at the surface, they're not going to be able to use their sonar to find me, but I can only be at the surface at night. So during the day, they stayed submerged along the bottom, and then at night, they would come up to the surface. They were faster on the surface than they were underwater. They were more maneuverable. And so they would come up, boat to wherever they needed to go, keep an eye out for merchant ships along the way, and attack as needed. And this method was pretty successful. This is a photo of the Dixie Arrow burning after being torpedoed by the U-71. And this occurred March 26, 1942. And this was a oil tanker. It had 96,000 barrels of crude oil. The U-71 had spent the night waiting near the Diamond Shoals light buoy, hoping to intercept targets. We were not blacking out the coast at this time, so the light buoys were on. There were shore lights, led to some help for the U-boats. With breaking dawn, the U-boat captain was about to order his boat to the bottom when he spotted the mass of the approaching tanker on the horizon. He maneuvered his boat against the zigzag course of the Dixie Arrow, trying to get the tanker between the U-71 and shore. At 8:58, 3 torpedoes slammed into the starboard side of the Dixie Arrow, and in less than 1 minute, the tanker was mortally wounded and engulfed in flames. The first torpedo hit at the midship deck house, destroying it and unfortunately killing most of the deck officers. And then 60 seconds later, the second and third torpedoes hit just aft of the deck house and cracked the ship in two, which is visible in this image. On top of that, all of that crude oil spilling out into the water made for a very fiery situation for that wreck and made it very challenging for anyone to have survived. So, like I said, very successful. From January to July, 397 ships were sunk and around 5,000 lives were lost. And I have a quote from a captain at this time. And he said, "On my most recent voyage north from Cuba, the last patrol planes I saw were 100 miles southeast of Miami. My course was inside the Gulf Stream track on the whole voyage from Florida to the Virginia Capes. I never saw one patrol boat or plane until we were off Currituck Beach, Light, Virginia, practically behind the torpedoed ship, the SS Malley. Shipping men are saying that they saw more patrol boats off our coasts during the days of Prohibition than now, when our nation is at war and enemy submarines are active everywhere." This was sent January 21st, 1942, to the Chief of Naval Operations. Sailors are aware. They are telling, and this is early on in this story. So we have this happening. We knew the Germans had U-boat capabilities. We knew that they had already been using them against Great Britain and France. Why were we unprepared? There are a couple of reasons for this. One of them, in 1940, the US exchanged over 50 World War I destroyers for British bases in the West Indies and British Guiana. So we said, you need these to fight, we're not fighting, here you go. Additionally, in 1941, we signed the Lend-Lease Bill with the United Kingdom that shared billions of dollars worth of American equipment by June 30th of 1942. So we are giving things to our allies, hopefully to support us. After Pearl Harbor, we also have some differing opinions among the individuals in charge. So first, we have Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King. He had studied extensively for a war with Japan and was very focused on the Pacific front. He wanted the naval forces in the Pacific for that battle. He also didn't necessarily trust the British and was a little hesitant about any British suggestion that was given to them. The person that was in charge of the Atlantic seafront was Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews. Now, initially, he was aware of what he had. He did not have a lot to begin with. He was given only 20 ships, some no more than barges, and one 160-foot Coast Guard cutter, 103 obsolete aircrafts, most of them down for repairs, to guard the 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th naval districts, That is 1,500 miles from Canada to the South Carolina border. That's not a lot of things to be working with. And so he looked at what he had and he sent multiple letters to Admiral King asking for assistance. Said, hey, you have a whole naval fleet at Hampton Roads in Norfolk. Can we use them? And Admiral King's response was, no, we need them to be ready to fight the German water on top of water fleet, or we need them to be ready to sail to the Pacific if needed. He also asked for additional aircraft, which were eventually given to him. He also did eventually get some more ships. But this differing opinion was challenging. Admiral Andrews did go through and do a full report, asked for a full report on why these German U-boats were sinking our ships, how are they doing it? And he discovered that they were doing this at night mostly, and that it seemed like the U-boats were using the lights from the shore to backlight the ships that they were torpedoing. And so he did also request a blackout, which again was initially declined, but did eventually get approved. So we have different opinions, and then, like I said, limited resources. There just wasn't much for him to use. That one Coast Guard cutter, the Dion, at least for this period of time, was managing that 5th district, which is Virginia, the bottom of Virginia to North Carolina. And here are a couple images from the Dion. On this one, you can't tell on the one on the left, it is actually them going to rescue a ship. But when I put my two photos on top of each other, the ship rescue part went away. But what you can see on there, if you see those barrels, those are going to be depth charges. And the thought, at least initially when they were assigned to go out and protect our ships against U-boats, was, okay, when there's a call, we're going to go straight to that wreck. But what they found out is that's a lot of territory to travel. And generally, by the time they made it to the shipwreck, or made it to the call, the ship had either sunk or was limping its way off. And if there was anyone to rescue, they had either already been rescued or they had drifted away. So it just wasn't a very successful method. The second method they went with was a grid system. So during the day, they thought, hey, our U-boats are going to be hanging out underwater. We can run this grid system back and forth and use our sonar, find the U-boat, drop the depth charge on it. And that is what's happening in this image on the right. There's an explosion that you can't really see, but they were testing the depth charges and doing a depth charge run. Just a fun fact that I found out. This is what happens when you put me in charge of a talk. The lieutenant who was in charge of this vessel, Jimmy Alger, he originally served on a World War I destroyer during Prohibition. He was very excited to get this Coast Guard cutter. 165 feet, much more maneuverable, it's gonna be great. But his father was also in command of a Coast Guard cutter, the cutter Manning, and his father was on that crew that responded to the wreck of the Carroll A. Deering in the winter of 1921. And if you have ever heard of that ship, it's sometimes called the ghost ship. When they made it out there, it was abandoned, but it looked like everyone had just sort of poof disappeared from the wreck. So a very interesting story. This is happening. Unfortunately, we were not very successful in these early months at catching U-boats. So Great Britain was a little concerned. Supplies were not making it to them. And they have this quote from Winston Churchill: "I am most deeply concerned west of the 40th meridian and in the Caribbean Sea. The situation is so serious that drastic action of some kind is necessary." So what is this aid that he provides? Well, the first, in February of 1942, Winston Churchill sent a fleet of converted British trawlers to the US. The Dianthus in the image is one of those British trawlers that were sent. It was originally a mail ship, but they retrofitted it for this purpose and added depth charges to it, and that's what they're hoisting up in the image. The US also requested the use of British naval ships, if any were available, to come and assist. And we requested 24 anti-submarine corvettes. The corvette was a French name, not a car, for a small sailing warship that was intermediate in size between a frigate and a sloop of war. And the thought with these smaller ships was they were intended as part of a convoy to escort ships that could be escort ships through. The corvettes could be produced relatively quickly. They had a long range, so they were a beneficial ship, not just coastally, but also in mid-Atlantic convoys. And additionally, the convoy system that the British had implemented earlier in the war was implemented in the United States. It took some wheedling and some going around people to get it to happen, but it did. Initially, as early as March of 1942, we have the Bucket Brigade, which was a really rudimentary convoy where you would be at an anchorage, and if there was another ship around you who could come with you, you would move from anchorage to anchorage up the coast. Additionally, in April, actually off of Cape Lookout, they started to create protected anchorages. So on April 10th, they laid anti-torpedo nets around the waters of Cape Lookout Bight to provide protection to ships so they could spend time there before they moved on. They also ended up placing a coastal artillery battery with 20-inch searchlights at that spot to look for those submarines. As of May 1942, the convoy system gets even better. We start to use more airplanes. So a circle with a radius of 20 miles was to be patrolled around the ships of the convoy, and searches were to be made along the track of the convoy 25 miles in either direction. So for example, a southbound convoy that was leaving Hampton Roads on the first day would be covered by planes from Langley Field, Norfolk, and Elizabeth City. On the second day, they would be covered by planes from Cherry Point. On the third day, from Charleston, and so on for the length of that journey. So having that aerial support on top of having, in an ideal convoy, 7 surface craft of 2 destroyers, 1 corvette, 2 Coast Guard patrol craft, and 2 British trawlers, led to more successful traveling for these vessels. All right, I've given you all of the background I'm going to give you, I promise. I'm now going to tell you the story of the Caribsea. So to start, our first player is the U-158. This was an IXC U-boat that was ordered in 1939, built in 1940, commissioned in 1941. During its lifespan, it sunk 17 ships and damaged 2, but it was eventually sunk off Bermuda in 1942. This first patrol is the one that we are interested in. So here is the story of their first patrol. On February 7th, they depart Germany and sail into the North Atlantic. On February 24th, they encounter an Allied convoy in the North Atlantic, and they make 2 hits on a British steam tanker, the Empire Celt. 6 of 52 individuals aboard are killed. That same day, just 2 hours later, at 10:35, they make 1 hit on the British motor tanker Deloma, damaging but not sinking the vessel. The vessel is able to make it to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and be fixed. On March 1st, the U-158 encounters the Norwegian motor tanker Finnegar, fires upon the vessel. Return fire occurs, but the U-158 eventually sinks the tanker, and all 39 members abandon ship but are not seen again. On the 11th of March, 1942, they have made it to the North Carolina coast. And this is where they run into the Caribsea and sink the Caribsea. On the 13th of March, they sink the John D. Gill, an American steam tanker with 142 barrels of crude oil on it. On the 15th of March, they damage the Olean steam tanker, which was empty. Most of the crew was rescued by the Cape Lookout and Fort Macon Coast Guard Station. And then also on the 15th of March, they sink the REO steam tanker headed to Texas. And after that very successful 4 days, they make their journey back and they land in France. And so this is where a lot of the U-boats were departing from. It was easier to get to their target, and France was already under German control at this time. And here is the list for that time. It includes the tons of each ship, and the first 3 were part of that convoy system. We are interested in the Caribsea. So here is the Caribsea, not the restaurant, but the ship. It was built by McDougall Duluth Shipping in Duluth, Minnesota. It was an oil-fired steamship built in 1919 as the Lake Flattery, and then renamed in 1923 and renamed again in 1940 to the Caribsea. And this vessel was captained by Nicholas Manolis, who said the SS Caribsea was a good ship, a sturdy 10-knot freighter. Her crew tried and found not wanting during several runs between New York and the West Indies, carrying commercial and US-based goods. They successfully completed 13 voyages. They carried manganese ore, explosives, and weapons mainly. That was what they were sending. On this fateful voyage in March, the Caribsea was en route from Santiago de Cuba to Baltimore, Maryland, with manganese ore, which is a common ingredient in steel production and an alloy component in aluminum, was highly combustible. Now, the quote that I gave earlier from the captain to the naval office is the same captain of this ship. He was well versed in what was happening. And on top of the safety precautions that were asked by the US Navy, he had a number of others. So one of them, he had the ship run in complete blackout at night, no light, no radio calls, no whistle blasts. They were trying to blend in. They also followed the Navy-issued route, which said to slow down to pass Cape Hatteras during daylight hours. So on March 10th of 1942, they were hanging out right off of Cape Lookout. They had slowed down so that they could try to pass Hatteras during the daylight hours the next day. He also had extra safety drills and lifeboats. So he talked about the 3 don'ts. This is what he trained his crew. Don't jump overboard. Don't cut the wrong lines. Don't launch the boat when ship is full speed ahead. And do keep your life preservers with you all the time. So those were his rules. He also was quoted in his own book that he wrote after this that said, "We're going to swing this lifeboat overside and keep it hanging over. After you secure it with breast lines, I want each and every one of you to become familiar with how and where each line is fastened until you know exactly which line is to be cut off and which one is to be lowered for quick launching." So he is really going through with his crew. And on this voyage, he did have a number of new crew members, so he was trying to get them up to speed. Each lifeboat station had an axe already there to cut the boats free. He also equipped the boats with a mirror or a shiny piece of metal to help attract potential rescuers if needed. On top of this, he did also have a couple of special extra precautions. One of them was having the radio operator on duty at night only. And he gave the radio operator permission to send an SOS the instant any danger arises without awaiting orders from the bridge. If you see it, call it. The same way, he gave permission to the engine crew to put the vessel fully astern the instant any trouble occurred, again, without word from the bridge. So he wants to successfully make it up the coast. Unfortunately, on the early morning of March 11th, 1942, about 11 miles east of Cape Lookout Lighthouse, the U-158 spots the Caribsea. They had actually been following another tanker, and had shot a torpedo at it, but then lost sight of it. The story is they saw the Caribsea, they actually thought it was a Coast Guard vessel, and they went, "Oh, that would be good to take down." Shortly before 2 a.m., the second mate reports 2 vessels. So he reports seeing the tanker, and then he reports another vessel that he couldn't get a good look at what it was to identify it. At 2 a.m., the ship was hit by 2 torpedoes. The first hit the number 2 hold, and the second hit midship. She sank in less than 3 minutes. There was no time to signal for help and no time to launch the lifeboats. Most of the crew ended up finding themselves in the water, swimming and trying to find something to grab hold of. 2 of the life rafts were blown clear of the Caribsea and were found floating upright. So crew members were able to climb in to the small boat. 7 of the men survived, 21 did not. And again, our captain has a quote, "I swam as I had never swum before, knowing that the Caribsea in her death throes would drag down with her all of us who had made her our home. 3/4 of the ship from bow up to number 4 hatch had already disappeared, and only her poop deck showed above the water. While swimming, I heard screams for help all around me, and I kept shouting, 'Swim away, men, swim.'" So, a very scary situation for these individuals. Even potentially not more scary, but also continued scary for the 7 who made it into the lifeboats. After the attack, the U-158 was observed passing within 300 yards of the survivors. The story goes that the U-boat circled the survivors in their lifeboat. As thankfully they did not attempt to attack, And as morning came, the crew was hopeful. They were waving a piece of plank and fabric around. They actually ended up finding a second boat and lashing them together. And that second boat had some supplies that the first boat had lost when it was blown off the ship, including a yellow signal flag. So the first opportunity for rescue comes at 8 a.m. 3 tankers being escorted by a destroyer pass within 3 miles, but they do not see the crew. At 8:30 a.m., a seaplane headed south flew by, but again, did not see them. And then at 10 a.m., a second seaplane flying north and then east also missed them. Very nerve-wracking if you're the crew. Thankfully, at 12:30 p.m., the survivors were able to signal a passing vessel by reflecting the sun using the lid of a chocolate biscuit tin that had been placed in the lifeboat. So that shiny metal was able to reflect the sun enough to draw the Norlandia, which was headed north to Baltimore, Maryland, over to them and pick up those survivors. For anyone who's interested, here's the information about the Norlandia. Built in Wisconsin, also an oil-fired steamship, just like the Caribsea, the same length as the Caribsea, and was built in the same year as the Caribsea. So this was built in 1919 at the Lake Galata, and then shifted names a couple of times. Unfortunately, it did meet the same fate of the Caribsea by being torpedoed by a U-boat in July of 1942. So back to our survivors. Our 7 survivors were transferred from the Norlandia to a U.S. Coast Guard dispatch vessel off of Cape Henry, Virginia, and then were taken to Little Creek Coast Guard Station in Virginia Beach. And here is a list of the crew. I know that this is small, it's kind of hard to see. The individuals in black are the ones who survived. The individuals in red did not. The 2 in yellow are North Carolina stories that I'm going to tell you in a second. But what's interesting to me is the diversity of the crew. There are individuals from Puerto Rico, from Chile, from all over the US, from Sweden, from Russia, from Hungary. It's a big diversity within this crew. So our 2 stories. The first I will start with is of a survivor. This was Elton B.T. Hewitt, who was born in 1911 in Supply, North Carolina. I'm going to say sort of with confidence, which is Brunswick County. He lived to be 79, so survived. He and all aboard the Caribsea were awarded the Merchant Mariner's Medal from Congress. And additionally, they were awarded the Combat Bar with 1 star. So here is that. And the medal honors any merchant marine killed, wounded, or who suffered through dangerous exposure because of conflict against an opposing armed force. And the Combat Bar was for seamen who served on a ship that was damaged by an enemy. The star is awarded if they were forced to abandon ship. He ended up living the last of his life down in Florida and sounded as though he had a good life in Florida. Our second story is of James Gaskell, who is a native of Ocracoke. And there are 2 stories for him. The first, the native, those who lived in Ocracoke, those who lived on the Outer Banks, those who lived in Emerald Isle, Salter Path, they were very used to seeing explosions. They were also used to walking the beach and seeing things wash up. So the first one here is his Merchant Marine officer letter. His cousin, Christopher Farrow Gaskell was walking the beach and found Jim's framed third mate license washed up on the beach. The news of the wreck had not made it to them yet. This is 2 days post shipwreck. So that is a hard way to potentially find out that you have lost a family member. The second story is about the ship's nameplate, which washed up at the Pamlico Inn, which was owned by James's family. The story that is told is that the day after the sinking, his father, Bill Gaskell, was cleaning up after a gale that had passed. Gaskell went down to the pier to inspect for damage and to see how well his and the other boats tied up to it had weathered the storm. Once there, he noticed a large plank beating against the pilings. Fearful that the heavy board might inflict further damage to the pier, he used a boat hook to push it away. As soon as the board was cleared of the reach of the hook, it came back, and he tried that again. And then the third time, he pulled the board up and saw that it was a spar bearing the name Caribsea. Now, this spar was then used by Homer Howard to make a gold plate for the United Methodist Church on Ocracoke. And the nameplate says, in memory of Captain James B. Gaskell, July 2nd, 1919 to March 11th, 1942. This cross constructed from salvage of the ship upon which Captain Haskell lost his life. So an enduring memory for him from that spar. Things for the U-158 didn't work out eventually. I mentioned that to you at the beginning, but they did return to France and they prepare for their second patrol. They did have a little bit of a reign of terror on that second patrol. From May 20th to May 29th, they sank 12 additional ships, representing 62,000 tons. Their last success was with the steam merchant Everalda, which is in the photo here. All 36 people on board the ship survive. 2 are taken prisoner, and the rest are set at sea in 2 life rafts. The ship was sunk by a boarding party that opened up the bottom valves, but the survivors are picked up by the U.S. Coast Guard, and 1 group is brought to Ocracoke, and 1 group is brought to Morehead City. Unfortunately, when they torpedoed the Everalda, they did make a little bit of a mistake. Some of the wireless signals were intercepted by Allied forces. And on June 30th, 1942, the PBM 3C Mariner flying boat out of Bermuda is directed to the point, and it drops 2 depth charges exploding directly under the stern of the U-158. Now, the U-158 has sunk. We know that the Caribsea sunk off of Cape Lookout, but it didn't sink super deep. So on May 23rd, 1942, the mast is mistaken for a periscope, and it ended up being depth charged. After that, the wreck was marked with a flashing red buoy. In 1944, it was demolished to a depth in excess of 40 feet by the Navy Salvage Service. Today, it is a dive site. So the wreck of the Caribsea is located within Noah's National Monitor, oh my gosh, my words. Noah's Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. Whew. And if you're so inclined, the local dive stores will take you out to dive on the Caribsea. I have not dove on it. I would like to one day, but I have not. But this is a site plan for that vessel, and you can see different things. Number 4 up at the bow is one of the anchors. Number 12 are the boilers. And in case you are not going to go scuba diving, we do have some photos of the wreck with a bunch of sea life. And if you notice on there are a number of sharks in those images. And this is where I tell you my background is marine biology, and we're going to take another quick detour to talk about sharks. So these are sand tiger sharks. They are a critically endangered shark. And if you go diving on this site, you are actually able to participate in a citizen science effort called Spot a Shark. So Spot a Shark is led by the North Carolina Aquariums and a number of other partners to gain information about these endangered animals by taking photos of them. Because our sand tiger sharks have unique spots along their side that allow you to identify them. And so you take your photo, you upload it, and then they analyze it. So here is one of these sharks that has been identified. And I pulled up that you didn't know you were getting a quiz, but this is your quiz. 3 options here of individuals who could possibly be a match to our shark. Now, what they do when they are identifying them is they look for any markings that are special. So I circled a couple on here. They're tricky to see, but they have kind of 3, this shark has 3 darker spots near the caudal fin or the tail, kind of a larger spots along the side, and then a couple big spots under those dorsal fins. Anyone have a thought, 1, 2, or 3, which individual it is? Oh, I see 1, I hear 2, I hear 2, 2, 2. It is individual 2. It is individual 2. Individual 1 and 3 are actually the same shark. I was limited with my photos. So 1 and 3 are the same, and then we have 2 there. And so now that I've quizzed you and made you talk about something that is not the wreck of the Caribsea, I want to thank you all so much for attending today. Our next Maritime Heritage Lecture is not until Thursday, April 9th, and that is the general history of mermaids that will be given by Associate Curator of Education, Christine Bryn. On Thursday, March 26th, if you're interested, we do have a new knot tying workshop that we are implementing called Can You Knot? And that is at 2 p.m. on that Thursday. Do you have any questions that I will try to answer? Yes. So, right. For those who are online, I'm just going to quickly repeat that conversation, was asking about which U-boat was sunk off of the North Carolina coast, and the U-85 was the answer. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. The folks being submerged. Mm-hmm. That is a great question. So the question is, when did radar become used in the marine environment to a wide amount? They were using sonar already and a pinging system in World War II. I don't know more about the prevalence though, and I don't want to misspeak on it. But it was something that was being used by both the Americans and the British during World War II. It's the tricky thing with sonar and radar sometimes is when you're on the bottom, when the ship is on the bottom, there can be enough other topography and changes in elevation that ships can hide. I've also heard stories of American submarines hanging out near the bottom and being blocked by the sound of snapping shrimp, because there will be big groups of snapping shrimp and they'll be making so much noise that it interferes with the sonar.
My question really had waiting. Wow.
Right.
Too much advantage still located right.
Gotcha, on the surface. At that time. That is a very good thought. That's a very good hypothesis, and I don't know the answer. There is also the question of, at this time, these first 6 months, there was limited materials and limited use of previously existing technology that was at Admiral Andrews' disposal because it was being used for other purposes. But that's a great question that I will have to look into more about. Mm-hmm.
Radar actually really found out that it was then they were on the officers about so I think radar is more in the early stages more effective. Like it's amazing though that how Japanese were first earlier than we have so much with the sign of Japanese war being the war due to my point
Mm-hmm.
But another question is kind of fun fact for me I want to ask you the size of Pearl Harbor, how many times do you have to be there back in the United States
Oh, that is a great question. I'm going to summarize again really fast for those online, and then I will let you answer your question. Tell me the fun fact.
In 1941, you had a Japanese submarine that actually surfaced off of Alpha in California over the they used for death guns to fire secondly was the they bombed one of the burned down the first day of the fire because guns and cigarette bombs on the first. They were so low one didn't explode.
Thank you for telling me. Yeah, I would love to, actually. That sounds great. Oh, it was the Caribsea. The Caribsea did not sink far enough. The depth of is around 90 feet for the Caribsea now. I will happily change places. Like I said, I am learning World War II. Thank you. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.